everyone, and welcome to our first III seminar of this term, which is hosted by the International Inequalities Institute at the LSE. My name is Kirsten Sehnbruch. I am a British Academy Global Professor and a Distinguished Policy Fellow at the III, and I am incredibly pleased today to welcome Ruth Kattumuri, Dr. Ruth Kattumuri today, who is also the head of our India Observatory, co-chair of our India Observatory. And she's going to be giving a seminar today entitled Understanding Vulnerabilities of Countries for Enabling Resilient, Inclusive and Sustainable Development, which is quite a topic. So welcome, Ruth, and thank you for coming. May I ask just before we start, our online audience, if I could ask you to put yourselves on mute for the time being while we listen to Ruth's presentation. And then as always afterwards, there'll be a chance for you to ask questions in the chat and also for people in the room, so we'll take questions after the presentation. So, Ruth, over to you.
You, Kirsten. I didn't realize this was the first seminar of the term. It's also my first seminar with III, so it's a bit daunting that I put the chance to mic before they're saying, how will this topic go down? You reassured me that it will be interesting. So I do hope it is interesting. Now this work, let me tell you a little bit about, my life has been at the UNC. Since the day I arrived more than 25 years ago. The India Observatory was something I founded in 2005, and we launched it in 2007, which was another US based in UK or US, something like that. So LSE is my family. However, during COVID, I had this opportunity, unintended and solicited, to work for this organization, where that's my paid job now. So I'm the Senior Director of Sustainable Development Directorate at the Commonwealth of Nations. Just to introduce you to the Commonwealth of Nations, it is not a UK Commonwealth. It is a consortium, an informal consortium of 56 countries. It is based on the Queen's tremendous work in connecting with former Commonwealth countries. However, then in the 50s, its remit broadened to say it's not only the colonial countries, but countries where democracy, rule of law, human rights, these are the principles. So last year in 2022, we had 2 new member countries who are Francophone countries. If you heard of Francophonie, these were countries which were governed by the French. So I just wanted to introduce you to what is the Commonwealth of Nations. It's informal, but the other kind of very interesting thing about this grouping is it is informal. It's got 56, and the smallest of the countries, population is about 11,000 people. Yes, and it's a small island, and it's the island of Nauru. And the largest country, can you guess? Yes, I heard India with a population of 1.4 billion people. It has developed economies, it has developing economies, it has vulnerable economies. Now, developed economies, guess? 4 are the rich countries, which are sometimes called ABC plus N, which is Australia, Britain, Canada, New Zealand. And India, of course, now is entering that space of large economies, of large population, that size as well. Then there are countries from Africa, Asia, Pacific, and Caribbean. So pretty much countries from all across the regions of the world. Now, one of the important roles of, I'm not just talking this because it is related to this one. One of the important roles the Commonwealth has played for decades, is that of enabling, giving a voice to the small island states, small states, vulnerable states, least developed states, giving them a voice and giving them a space to express their challenges and their problems. And I often say that Paris Agreement would not have happened in 2015, but for that enabling convening, giving them the empowerment for decades before that. Because I've sat at tables, not at the Commonwealth, but in other meetings where small states have sat during COPs, before COPs planning, saying we could disappear. So whatever the size of your country, you're still a sovereign country. And this is one of the great things about the Commonwealth of Nations, just call it speak, is that it gives a voice and enables, and it has an equal position for every country at the table. So when we organize ministerial meetings, I just organized a Commonwealth Environment and Climate Ministers meeting alongside the UN General Assembly last week. And in 2 weeks' time, I'll be arranging the Commonwealth Finance Ministers meeting, Central Bank Governors meeting with all the 56 countries alongside World Bank and IMF. But the point is that nobody can abstain. Any decision that has to be made, you can't abstain like other intergovernmental organizations. You have to have a consensus, and every single country sits at the table as an equal. And I think that's significant for us in this conversation when we're talking about policies. So with that, I'll come to this. Let me come to this. Work this out. Yeah, okay. So what is one of the first things that came to my table when I joined the period was the fact that the Commonwealth has been producing something called the Economic Index for maybe 25 years or so. Then when it came to me in 2020, that's when I joined this institution. We were in the middle of COVID. We said, oh, this has been hanging there for a long time. We need to do this. So I said, I will not do economic index. Yeah, we are in 2020. So that's how I designed the index to be economic, environmental, and social was in my mind because we were all frozen in the middle of COVID. So I said, how can we think about health challenges, vulnerabilities, and pandemics are here to stay. You know, we forgot about the 2011 situation, but I do hope that we will not forget the freeze we had, and we continue to struggle with COVID even now. So I do hope that they are here to stay, but we have to be prepared. So this is the work I started with WHO, which includes pandemic preparedness. So they're here to stay. So I said social. So let's put that into the index to understand these kind of social challenges. Then somewhere deep down, as an academic all my life, first in India and then here, somewhere the challenges of young people's lives in today's world has always bothered me in recent years, whether it's the Arab Spring, whether it is the crisis in Hong Kong, where young people's problems have, and their freedoms have been squashed. I said political, there's going to be lots of political challenges going forward. So that's why I put in socio-political, but I didn't expect 2022, I never dreamt that come January 2022, the world will be suffering under one of the most serious political conflict of our times, all of our times. So that's just to give you the framework of the index. So it has these three components. So here are some facts about why UVI, or UVI is Commonwealth Universal Vulnerability Index as it's called. We produced this report in 2021. So this is a giving the voice to small states. So if you look at why UVI, you see there are others. There's COMSEC, which I said was the economic one. There's CDB. CDB is the Caribbean Development Bank. And then the UN has its own index of different forms. They are there, they're all there, but each one sometimes has some things and doesn't include some things. So there was a need for an index at that time. Right now, some of you may know that the UN is in the process of launching the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index, and hopefully it will be launched. It started, but it hopefully will be launched during Morocco World Bank IMF meetings, formally launched, but it's still going on in consultations for the last 2 years. And right from the beginning, because our report was done way back in 2021, we have been informing and working with the UN on the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index that hopefully should come out. And I was telling you in weeks ago, saying if it's not released soon, it will lose its relevance. So that's what it is. This is about understanding vulnerabilities, because it's also not just doing an index for the sake of an analytical work, but what is its practical utility? Because the world has changed, and some of these systems that existed with respect to access to development finance and climate finance are 70 years old, sometimes before some of these countries existed. And the access to finance is based on GDP per capita. So if you're a country, you graduated to middle income, you don't get concessional financing, and you are literally blown away with the climate disaster. So where do you go for money? So what does Africa do, for example? The president of Africa at the Paris summit, which happened a month ago, and sometime in July, I forget the months have been so much all over the place. So when President Ruth says, I have to pay $11 billion a year in debt, yes, the loans that the country needs, how am I going to do development? So you see the developing countries are paying much more in debt, the interest on their debt, because they get interest, debt or money, financing at a much higher interest than developed countries, because the rating, we have Standard & Poor's here. So the rates are determined by what the world thinks are, they're secure, and so we can give them at lower debt and things like that. So I'm mixing all these things because it's the relevance of this index. So the intention of this index, or this is what the index has been doing, is how do we contribute, advocate, contribute, provide the evidence to say that this criteria of access to development finance based on GDP per capita alone is outdated and is not valid anymore. And I put another thing, which is in the last slide, is about, there is a whole lot of conversation going on, that some of you may be aware of the new financial architecture. And that is what is going to build into all these things. Conversations are building into this as to what does the new financial architecture have to do. It has to factor in the world we are in so that there's an equitable process of access to finance. I finished my seminar, friends. But I'll just go through the slides. So let's go back to some of the details of the working. So what's done in this index is, this is again others. So you have the Caribbean Development Bank Index, which uses this, they call it Multidimensional Vulnerability Index. It takes in export concentration, export destination. So these are the variables that they take into consideration for their index. And this one on the right, as I said, was quite old, 2014, had been doing it from before, but it was primarily an economic vulnerability index. We made these slides available so you can see them later. When I mentioned the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index, this is the UN framework. As I said, we have informed and fed into this index. So the new thing about this is what is interesting, so also with the UBI, is looking at countries' vulnerability and resilience. How resilient are they? Because knowing the resilience makes it important to see to what extent can they can absorb shocks. And some of the shocks are exogenous. Some of the shocks are COVID or climate and all kinds of shocks. So in terms of vulnerability, what the UN has done is they've done, I said UBI has economic, environmental, and socio-political. NBI has done economic, environmental, and social. They didn't want to get community. Now I can understand this. UN has to struggle with getting consensus from 103 countries. I have to struggle with getting consensus from 36 countries. So my job was easy. The second one is risk, but UN can take care of itself with an iron. So they can do one, and that's why, because the challenge with this is you can produce something, but you cannot launch it if every single country agrees with that. So UN is still, it's like more than a year and a half, and it's still trying to finalize the report. The other aspect is resilience. Again, resilience taken as social, this is the vulnerability resilience so far. Now, this is just introducing you to the nomenclature, the small states, the small island developing states, and these developed countries. So small states are countries with population less than 1.5 million, and they have severe vulnerabilities to economic and environmental shocks. Small island developing states, less than 1.5 million, again, small population, but they're islands, so they have exposure to more environmental and economic shocks. So in terms of islands, we have about 33 small states, members of Commonwealth, and 25 small island states. Among the islands, the smallest island, as I said, is 11,000 people, and the largest island on the blue theme of the Commonwealth is Papua New Guinea, which has 10 million people. So that's kind of, and then of course, least developed countries, which in many ways, these developed countries are in the continent of Africa. So now this is the Universal Vulnerability Index. As I said, it's got the other thing about it is we've done structural vulnerability, and we've also looked at resilience, but looking at resilience, which is structural as well as non-structural. Now, sometimes we can measure the structural resilience because, and it's really important to understand that, but very often a country's capability to absorb a shock or recover from a shock is because there is not a structural resilience that it has. So that also impacts the impact it has in the country and the recovery ability to recover that it has. So in terms of vulnerability index, as we said, this is economic vulnerability, external and natural shocks, as well as physical only, because it all depends on the data. What is the variables we've used is dependent on the data that we have. Much of the data we have actually comparing between 2010 and 2018. So any of you interested, find new data and do more work, I'd be very happy with that. So there is, the data we use is mainly World Bank, UN, Multidimensional Organization data, but I think if we need to do more in-depth work on this, there should be other ways and other data. That's fine. So what does the index do? So it is vulnerability by resilience. It measures that. And so what it says is if the UVR is over 1.5, then it's extremely vulnerable. If it's between 1.5 and 1, it's highly vulnerable. And then the vulnerability goes down. If it's less than 0.5, then it has a certain level of resilience. So the structural vulnerability is a measure using those three criteria that is based on the data: vulnerability to external and natural shocks, physical vulnerability to climate change, that's measuring the environmental, and the internal violence index, that's measuring the social. And in terms of resilience, we've got the structural resilience index and non-structural resilience index, so measuring the resilience. So what does the structural resilience include? It's looking at human development, demographic structure, structural market connectivity, and then we've got all these other variables below: poverty rate, education health, and education measuring average years of schooling, adult literacy rate, and health share of population not undernourished. So we're taking only certain variables, and the constraint, as we all know, as researchers, data is always the constraint. So these measures are the ones for accounting for it. So the gap is that there is room, as you get more data, finer data, to do more of the analysis as well. Non-structural resilience is an index, is measured by quality of governance, macroeconomic stability, and quality of the regulation index. And some of these measure voice and accountability that people have, rule of law, control of corruption, and then we've got macroeconomics as an inflation index, public debt, foreign currency reserves, and as quality regulation, ease of doing business. So score. So what is the results show? Now you can see where the vulnerability is the highest. So the region where the highest vulnerability exists is where the red is the highest vulnerability. And then you can see the shades 1 to 1.5, again, Africa, and you've got a bit in South America, and then you've got other parts where the orange is also significant. And then again, yellow as well, you can see much of it is in the developing economies really. And here is another way of analyzing it or presenting it. So if we look at worst case, self-made, prodigal son, this is called low vulnerability, low resilience, and best case. So high vulnerability, low resilience is in the top left quadrant, And high vulnerability, high resilience is in the top right. And then you've got low vulnerability, low resilience in bottom left, and best case as a low vulnerability, high resilience in bottom right. So what the data does show very clearly is the least developed economies are the most vulnerable. So the Commonwealth countries are marked by circle pink and non-Commonwealth blue. You've got small states as triangles. So basically, instead of spend too much time on it, but just to say that the data clearly shows, okay, here's something. So classification of developing countries, vulnerabilities, if you look at blue things, least developed countries, as you can see, are either extremely vulnerable or highly vulnerable, or to some extent vulnerable. And you see the 6 as in small island developing states. Again, they have some resilience because these are some of the countries which are middle income countries among small states. For example, say Bahamas, because they won't graduate because they are not low income countries because they have external revenue flows into some of these countries. So in a way, some of the 6 are countries like Bahamas. That's where you see the green in this mixed ball. Then small states, again, there are some, they may be small. For example, if you take like Mauritius is a small island state, but there are some small states which are wealthy. If you take Singapore, for example, it has the highest GDP per capita, for instance, but Singapore is a small state, it's got what, 5, less than 5. So this clearly shows the LDCs are the most vulnerable. And then you've got the small states and the small island developing states. Now, LDCs are vulnerable because their economies are not resilient, or their economies are low economies, low income. Whereas in the case of SIDS, the vulnerabilities are more due to climate challenges that they have, because every year they're facing typhoons, hurricanes. While increasingly we see that extreme weather events, this is what some of us who've been working on environmental issues for at least 15 years, we're saying that the severity and the frequency of extreme events will increase because of climate change. And we are all seeing it in our living rooms today. Yeah? Before, when you say it theoretically and analytically, people won't get it. But now you see it. And it's not only small islands which are being trashed by these typhoons. All countries, everywhere. Look at the temperature today in London. But the issue is that small island states don't have the resilience or the ability to recover by the nature of their characteristics. They have small populations, they have small economies, and they have small landmass, and they're remote. So this is why there are countries who have been sitting at the table saying we will disappear. This is why for small island states, it's a real existential threat. So what are some countries doing? So countries like Maldives are trying to raise the land. They're trying to create higher ground, raise the land. There's some other countries like Vanuatu talking about legal aspects of moving people out of the country when they face a threat. So how do countries really will recover or survive in all these existential threats they face? Now this is by regional grouping, country regional grouping. So you can see Africa is again the most vulnerable in the grouping of countries. Americas, by Americas, these are South America as well. So this is where you have high vulnerabilities. Then you've got Asia, the Caribbean, Europe, and I don't know. I often say London is a small island developed state. So I don't know what will happen to us if there's huge amount of environmental challenges which we face. When I first came here 25 years ago, I used to say, it never rains in London, it only drizzles. There are moments when I said, oh my God, this is like the monsoon. As you can see, I'm originally from India. So now this gives you a picture of the actual scoring. So again, if you look at the pink, I don't know if you can read it, the pink is the African region, and the index are, you can see Sudan is 1.72, Chad is 2.06, you've got Ethiopia is 1.18, so several countries are above 1 or in 3.7. So again, the same thing reflected here, African countries have the highest Vulnerability Index regionally. And then you've got Asia, which is sort of between, this includes Korea, Malaysia, Singapore. It's like 0.36, which is probably the smallest, which is Republic of Korea, and Pakistan and Afghanistan, which is highest with 1.59, and Pakistan 1.19. And as we know, that Pakistan's flood last year, 1/3 of the population was affected. But I also think some of the issues with Pakistan, that large amount, I don't know if anybody is still from Pakistan, because that was a really horrendous thing, but the challenge was more governance as well, that it could not, they didn't have the governance mechanisms to move those people from the regions, because we have early warnings now. It's not that people don't know. And then there are countries which are taking that opportunity and trying to move people. But Pakistan was perhaps, the problem was so immense that they just gave up because they knew governance and managing it wise. They did not have the capacity to move them. But it is a big situation because 1/3 of the population of about 250 million being affected is not a joke. So that's the scoring of the index. So this is what I was talking about. So that's about the index. Now the purpose of the index is not just doing the theory analytical work, but how do we change the debate? How do we make this change happen with changing the financial architecture, which is not dependent on GDP alone with respect to access to development and climate finance. If you were following COP27, I think one of the first important outcomes was the loss and damage fund. That is taking into factor the fact that countries suffer loss and damage. They need special funds to recover and manage their losses and the damage to the economy. So Pakistan was one of the biggest strong push for the loss and damage fund. But the fund, as of now, the joke goes that there's a fund with no funds. Yeah? This is my COP28. The target now is to actually get money into that fund. The other thing, so this movement, because it's almost like COVID has made us all wake up and also made us a little bit more responsible in thinking. So the movement about changing the argument about access to development finance by multinational development banks and other institutions is gaining momentum. So the World Bank is also increasingly getting more committed to change this debate and see how these things are done, which is taking into factor. Before that, vulnerabilities were not taken into factor at all. But I think one of the first mechanisms that has taken in vulnerabilities is called the RST, the Resilient Sustainability Trust Facility. This was launched by the IMF. And so what it does is it gives access to funding for countries based on their vulnerabilities. And again, it just was to show how the Commonwealth countries are among the countries where they are more vulnerable. So out of the first set of countries which have been given the RST funding, 5 of them are Commonwealth countries. And these are Barbados, Jamaica, Bangladesh, Rwanda, and the other 2 are Costa Rica. I forget 2 others. But the point is that the need, and the whole thing is just seeing that the UN debate was about SDG summit, climate ambition summit. And the reason for these is we are in the midway of the SDG 2030. So this whole stock take is happening. And this is why this year is extremely important, because the world is coming together to say, let's take a stock of where we are and let's try to make sure that we actually achieve our SDGs as well as our NDCs, the nationally determined contributions on climate, because it's a stock take for NDCs as well. And for doing these, to implement these, that just on paper is not enough. To implement these, we need finance. And the big thing is there is money. The distribution of the money, the access to money is the biggest challenge. The other thing is about public finances alone cannot meet the immensity of the challenge, the problem that exists there. What we do need is private money to come into the picture. But for private money to come into play with this, we have to fix our systems. So we have criteria. How do we put in systems which give the trust between the public sector and the private sector, because there's not full trust. Because there are challenges, whether we call it, you know, culture, whatever. So to make that happen, we need to put in mechanisms and systems to enable that to happen. Unless private sector funding is incorporated into access to finance, we won't be able to meet our needs. But there is a lot of money out there. So I will stop there and I think that's the last one. So I just put some links, including me, who you might like to look at, but some of the things you can just search in the Google world, you're in a chat GPT world. I don't even need to give you the moderators.
Thank you, Ruth. So thanks for this great presentation with a lot of information and very insightful. I'm going to open the floor now to questions. Peter, are you going to be monitoring online questions? And then let us know. So my suggestion is to bundle that, if that's okay with you, Ruth.
Yeah, that's very big question. Very quick notes. First, I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the composition and the aggregation of the index. Just in terms of like technical understanding, how you got to this aggregation formula and also the data, like what was the process there, and have you done analysis of, you know, how the results were changing, especially the rankings, I guess, of the results, if different aggregation formula have been applied and different data have been chosen. The justification of the aggregation, the selection of data, basically. Then closely related to that, who was involved in picking all of this? I mean, you mentioned that you wanted something relatively specific and focused to the country. So how was the participatory process, if there was any, of making sure that every country's perspective was included in the process, which I guess seems to be important for ownership and support for this going forward. And then lastly, so what you presented on the last slide, the application. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about why you think or hope that this is actually going to be used, especially if you compare it to other indices. I don't know, maybe there's empirical proof of concept. This is completely different from what other indices are doing. I suspect it's probably not, because we see that different indices still produce more or less the same results. And then also, in order to actually make the case that these countries would need prioritization over others, wouldn't someone like the IMF or the World Bank still need one benchmark to apply for everyone? It seems a bit dodgy if they would go and say, oh, we use this one for all your countries, and then we use a different benchmark for everyone else. So wouldn't that still necessitate something like the full UN? So you would have to get the other 138 countries on board to also join your index in order for that to work. But maybe you've had meetings and know that, you know, there's use for this. Thank you.
You've got a lot to answer there. Let me just take a quick show of hands of whether anyone else has a burning urgent question, or can that wait till the second round and give you a chance to respond? Yeah, is that good?
Can we?
Is it data related?
No.
We'll wait, I'll do the data one. Did you have your
Yes, yes, it's about the what is the measures the structural residence. Yes, what is the measure and where we can find the data. So I don't understand how is the measuring the residence and the difference between structural and non-structural resilience and the other measure.
I'm going to keep my response very simple. So while I designed this thing, we worked very collaboratively and with Professor Patrick Goulimont, and he has been working on these vulnerability indices for a very long time. So all I'm going to say is, for the purposes of this meeting, the link is there. You can see the report, with this one, and you can get that. See this one. The report is posted there. Just go through it. But what I would clarify is what did we choose would depend on the data that existed. But I indicated to you what were the variables, what were the criteria that the data. So this is why I said we can still do a lot more work. I showed you the variables. Those were taken based on the data. But there is a need, I think, depending on data availability, we can do so much more to fine tune and understand this better. Now the application, how does it work? So as you heard, there are several indices out there. And don't tell anybody I said this, because obviously if the UN index comes out, that will be the norm, right? It goes through, or when it is formally launched, that would become the norm because it's 193 countries. But I know the Commonwealth UVI was already being looked at by Asian Development Bank, because the Development Bank looks into multiple indices that exist there, and they choose which works for them. Now, just to clarify, the Commonwealth Index is not just Commonwealth countries. We did the data and the analysis for 138 countries for which we had the data. So this is kind of, and it's good to compare rather than just choose a group of 56 countries and compare. So we still have done it for 138 countries based on all the variables where the data was available for the variables we chose. Similarly, I'm sure the UN would have done it for 192 countries based on the countries for which they had the data. So those who are interested in the data and the analysis, go to the report because it has the data sources, but I would put it out there saying if any of you think you want to look into this and have access to other sources of data and want to do this with PhD, I don't think it would be a master's dissertation. Come and talk to me. Right? Definitely, there's more that can be done.
Hi. Thank you very much. I'm Pedro from Chile. So you mentioned in the last part of your talk that there is money. The hard thing is to distribute it, and how if I got it right, how the governments would implement policies that could lower the vulnerability or rise the resilience, right? But then you mentioned that governments or states should help private finance to jump in, and I wonder what did you what would be that? What would be the private sector? What could they do?
So it's not just countries. Now that's financing. Also, financing for countries. It's a whole different topic. We can spend, we can get into that for a long time. But just to respond to you quickly, this access to financing. So it's the vulnerable countries, is the least developed countries, is the small states, which need adequate access to finance at a rate that they can cope with. Yeah. Not that, that's why I gave you the example of President Ruth saying, I'm paying $11 billion a year to repay debt. Yeah. And then where does he have the money to do development, right? So it's not a national conversation alone, it's a global conversation. It's a global conversation involving multilateral banks, IMF, World Bank, AIIB, because AIIB is a big lender now, ADB, or all these organizations. UN is a policy institution. We are a policy, so we suggest policies, but making that finance happen has to be by multilateral development banks. These banks have to change their criteria. They have to change the debate. That's one of the things that has been done by advocacy through evidence-based analysis to say, yes, you have to do that. And that's why these look into these indices to see how do they make funding access, on what criteria. So this is why the example of RST is one of those new facilities. Private sector financing. I have countries come and tell me saying private sector won't invest in, say, Seychelles or Mauritius, because for them, return on investment is marginal, if at all. Then other countries will say, okay, we are investing in green technology in this country, but it's not working. So how does so I'm trying to answer your question about how does private sector come in? The facilities on both sides are not ideal right now, right? Because the private sector has its own principles. It functions because it has return on investment. But if you want small countries, the money that's required and what they get back on it is not valid. So this is why one of the things we've been trying to say is that you have to think about regional projects. So one example would be large investment projects that are regional. For example, if you go to the Caribbean, traveling between the Caribbean islands is impossible, yeah? Because the transport, the infrastructure that exists is crazy. I was in the Pacific a few weeks ago. I just went to 3 islands, Tonga, Papua New Guinea, and Fiji, yeah? The long journey I was dreading, but the journey from London via LA to Nandi, which is the international airport in Fiji, that was manageable, although it was more than 22 hours. But the worst experience for me was going from Nandi to Tonga. And I was going to Tonga because the UN was having a regional conference there. It took me 8 to 9 hours to get to Tonga, which was just a 1-hour flight. I'm just giving an example. So there's a need for infrastructure development. There's a need for so many aspects of development in many of these countries. They need finance. Private sector can come in with finance and build the infrastructure, but the mechanisms are not still in place, which are convenient for both. So this is where that movement has to happen. So this is where I think there is a move now where even with respect to, say, the World Bank making announcements saying they will tap into private sector funding so that it facilitates what the private sector needs. It will give those opportunities and mechanisms can set in place, and that funding can be sourced into the countries through these things. So now we have other challenges, right? Look at the debt crisis in Sri Lanka. This is not a private sector issue, but it's about different multilateral lending agencies where many countries get trapped in debt. And I think it was public, right? What happened in Sri Lanka? That process to help Sri Lanka with its recovery is still not sorted out. Because at least I was pleased when in 2022, Sri Lanka finally went to the IMF, so that you have a more international system rather than get trapped in a debt with one unilateral multilateral. So private sector, the systems need to be put in place so that private sector doesn't have a disadvantage, plus the trust. And I was talking to Alex earlier about, say, one of the things I've been working on is ESG. It's called environmental, social, and governance. That is some of these criteria mechanisms to facilitate more reliable and trusted criteria to enable financing between public and private sectors. Long answer, but I think it's answered in some way. Yeah, I saw your hand first.
The issue of trust is a huge issue, particularly given the economic conditions. And then I happen to be from Pakistan. The performance of our countries on the climate front as well does not help in building that trust. And you've mentioned trust a couple of times. I wonder what your advice is for countries like myself that need to do a lot to build their resilience.
Two more. I saw one hand here. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm from the country of Georgia, where a large part of the development is supported by both public and private sectoral chain financing. So I'm wondering if you have done work or if you know of specific indices or criteria that measure the productive utilization of aid for addressing these vulnerabilities within countries.
Sorry to
No,
keep you
but
back on
I
sustainable
saw
finance.
3 of you, so I'll take all 3 and then.
Going back, just going back to sustainable finance. So thinking about private sector involvement in that, one thing that we see is slightly 2-part question. It's about the regulatory structure, as you mentioned. Like, for example, the EU and the SFDR regulations and so on have established this idea of how, for example, private companies can disclose their investments in ESG-related investments and how they can talk about the impact they're creating. So do you see this as a sort of like, dispersing more in a more applicable method to developing countries or different parts of the world, which can then sort of accelerate the level of investment? And on a slightly related note, we see this sort of structure created for environmental and climate change related investment, but we don't see the same level of uptake or data or clarity around social investments or social impact investments, either in sort of social impact bonds or social credit and this kind of areas. Do you see this idea that somehow environmental sort of investment, because of the clear metrics and sort of quantitative nature of it, is just easier to measure and therefore easier to invest in, as opposed to, for example, social investments?
Yeah, so let me take the finance thing first, because in terms of financing, there is this fuller understanding, and also the magnitude of the problem is so high, and also the fact that it can be solved. Because we're putting numbers in, we need 4 trillion, 4 billion, whatnot. But the thing is that enabling that, there is a strong appetite now, and you have some good leadership as well at the international level. The Prime Minister of Barbados, I think, is one of the very effective leader these days. And World Bank having Banga there, I think he understands the South, problems of the global South. And so having people like that is also helping move that debate. Now, public-private, I think, so there's a motivation to improve those criteria, firstly. Then about bonds. Bonds is that there are a whole range of bonds there, which is being working. Green and blue bonds are almost passé now, because there are so many more. For example, sustainability bond. There's the debt for nature swaps, and even debt for nature swaps is not adequate in my view. It works for small countries because it works in that situation, but they have a utility. So I think, in fact, even debt for nature swaps is being changed to debt for something swaps, because it can go into any kind of thing. So I think aspects such as sustainability bonds then give you room to put in anything there. Yeah. And the last thing I would say is, so they're not so well known, or they're not so talked about, but the aspects of social, for example, gender inclusion. The other thing, I'm talking about the debates that we're having at the international policy level. The other thing is about youth being at the table, because the future is yours, and you have to be at the table in the conversations. You have to contribute. You ask me about UVA, I say, now you come and tell me what data is there, and I want you to be at the table, to be at the table, to find solutions together. So one last thing I'll say on finance is, in the past, debt was always under the table, right? It's hidden. You don't talk about debt of countries. But today, debt is center stage, with everything, not just economic, but the quantum of debt has gone up when countries have to recover from their climate challenges. So it's now center stage. So it's about how do we manage those debt? How do we do those things? And one more thing there was, in addition to all these global financing, some of the work that we are focusing on is also own source revenue. What do countries, what does a country have to do itself? Yeah, you tell me when to stop. Yeah. So what does a country have to do to solve its own problem? It's not just depending on global finance, international finance. A country should also put mechanisms in place. So that's another part of the work, own source revenue or national revenue. Now that goes into the question about Pakistan. Now the challenge is internal, national, lovely people, yes. But the challenge, but this is where you, young people, and young people are playing a strong role. And I think we need more young people to be the voice if we have to, because it's a very deeply ingrained challenges of the country. To change that, we need a whole change of mindset. And we need young blood, young leaders. So I wish you the best for that. Last question on Georgia. Now, Georgia, I think there are several mechanisms there. So it depends on specifically what is it that you want to look at. But the questions you're asking are questions in the global debate, in the global conversation. So it's more like the development debate, which means the information is there. Look at what's happening in OECD, what's happening in EU, what's happening in UN. So many of these documents and reports are out there. You'll be overwhelmed by them. Don't overwhelm yourself. Narrow your focus, narrow your question search to what you are particularly interested in, but there's lots out there. So here I think no more questions. Unless somebody, hi.
Thanks very much for your talk. So it seems to me that a lot of vulnerabilities are actually corrosive and they affect one another. And so when we look at an increase in environmental vulnerability, I wonder if it does not make more sense to not see that only as an increase in overall vulnerability, but an increase in, for example, one of the other factors like social vulnerability. So how do we factor in these interdependencies, these interactions, and how different social components might react to changes and thereby exacerbate the overall level of vulnerability? How does your index deal with such phenomena?
So the index, as you saw, is not doing any interactions. Yeah, so there is, and it's a really, it's right that there are interactions. As a statistician, I know that interactions are important, but very often it's when you do the interactions, it's about validity of those results as well. These are data constrained. But so at the moment, most of what I've seen in terms of analysis and indices is not able to do interactions. But on the other hand, trying to look into these different aspects, economic, environmental, socio-political. So in a way, that's why there's room for more work. And then of course, it depends on, sometimes results can come garbled, right? So it has to make sense as well, the results. This is why when these results clearly showed least developed economies are the most vulnerable, I knew we were on the right track, because the consultation I had to do was with 56 countries, not data, because they are member countries, they had to agree for this one. So there was a lot of pushback because countries in the Caribbean, again, don't say I said this, they were pushing back saying we are the most vulnerable. Fair enough, they're lobbying for what they need, but their vulnerability is due to climate. But the real terms is LDCs are the most vulnerable. So the analysis, the results should also be make sense, but interactions definitely. This is why, for example, even climate issues, it's about social aspects include some things like who is most affected, the women, the disabled, because even that conversation is coming. So when there's a crisis, rescuing and saving the disabled is a challenge, but we have to factor that in to ensure that we protect and save them to rescue as well. Because the problem is the shocks are exogenous. And sometimes they're not, and the frequency and the regularity and the intensity with which they're coming is high. I mean, I was very happy I wasn't in London when it was very hot that week. I dreaded the 42 degrees of last year. I'm an Indian, but I changed too. So the world is in a mess. But the good thing is that we don't have to be in a mess if we all work together, but we have to find solutions fast together.
Peter, can I just ask how many questions have you got online?
We haven't got
Right, last question.
Yeah, sorry. So in addition to political vulnerabilities, one thing that really is a real determinant of how countries respond to natural disasters is their integration into world institutions, their partnerships. So we saw last year with Turkey and Syria, that Turkey was much more capable of generating aid than the Syrian one. So might it be useful to also consider these links and networks that countries have?
That's the resilience. That's what's captured in the resilience. So, I mean, at networks, how they access, and it's not just network. Networks is an important thing because I sometimes wonder how Bangladesh, I don't know if there's anybody from Bangladesh here, how Bangladesh is in the front of the line and every facility. And I'm sure it's got something to do with networks. But it's also about, are you from Bangladesh? No. So, but it's not just networks, but it's also what is the country's capacity to be able to absorb that, to repay that. Those are the real criteria about access to finance as well. And for example, Morocco, right? There was a whole thing when we have to go last week before last, there was this challenge saying, should we go or shouldn't we go? Because when you look at the real situation, don't believe the media or even social media for what you see very narrowly, because news will show nothing to do with communications, my dear Emma. But it's about, they take one picture and they show it like a loop, right? But so I was talking to people who are from the country, so what is the reality? So the area where the IMF World Bank meetings are happening, it is there. But there's still, it was okay because it's being built, that didn't get affected. It was the Atlas Mountains and other regions nearby. But of course, all the rehabilitation, recovery work has to go to where the crisis is. But my thing was, I know what the IMF World Bank will think is that by doing it, you're contributing to the country's economy and thus contributing to the recovery. Because if you don't go, you're actually stressing that country. So the country wanted it. Then of course, at the end of the day, you're going to have like, I don't know, 20,000 people there. It's not easy. And I do not recommend you go to this. I go only because I have this. I hate crowds, by the way. I know some people thrive in crowds. But so the thing is about what do we do? Now, this one argument, there was a lot of argument against it, but still Morocco, I'm sure that relationship and the fact that principal policy-wise, IMF World Bank would have thought like what I'm saying to say we have to go and do it. So there are multiple factors, and this is where measuring the resilience is important. And also that's why 2 types of resilience, structural as well as non-structural. But interactions, if you get the data and want to do some interaction, happy to talk to you. But you have to do the work.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you for all your questions and for participating in the debate. And well, look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you.
First.